Gilbert Ryle was an influential Oxford philosopher of the early to mid 20th century, who, like many Oxford philosophers at the time, was influenced by Wittgenstein, particularly the later Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein himself was based at Cambridge, like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, but Oxford was experiencing a huge expansion at the time because they'd launched a major that became very popular, which was politics, philosophy, and economics. And it meant that every one of the 30 colleges in Oxford had to have its own philosophy staff. So it's hired a huge number of people. So Oxford Cambridge had been sort of the center of philosophy early in the 20th century because of Moore and Russell, but then Oxford sort of became much more influential in the 40s and 50s. Gilbert Ryle was one of these figures, and his most important work is probably The Concept of Mind, which is a book, and this is the introductory chapter of that book. In this chapter, Descartes' myth, he talks about something called the official doctrine. So, most of this chapter is explaining what he thinks is wrong with the official doctrine, which is essentially Cartesian dualism about the mind. Okay, so a little bit of background. Descartes argues for, famously, two kinds of stuff. The universe is composed of two kinds of stuff. Descartes himself was a great scientist and mathematician. He invented coordinates, Cartesian coordinates. So that's a major contribution outside of philosophy. And he's one of the early figures in the Renaissance, where you're getting this huge explosion of scientific advances. So he is convinced that matter, the material world, stuff that takes up space that you can put coordinates on, is deterministic. So there are these laws that, for example, Newton argued for, that govern the behavior of all material objects. So any material object follows rigid laws that determine its behaviors. This is why science is able to predict with great accuracy the position of, for example, heavenly bodies, where they're going to be. You can predict well in advance of where they're going to be, and they turn up there. Because the entire material universe is like a giant clockwork mechanism. It follows rigid rules and it behaves in an entirely predictable way. Now, our bodies are clearly part of the material universe. They take up space. However, if it turned out that this included our minds and our personalities, then it looks like we are not free, because it looks like we too are part of this giant clockwork mechanism, and our thoughts and feelings could be predicted, could be just as predictable as the behavior of matter. Now, a contemporary of Descartes, slightly older than Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, was totally okay with this. Thomas Hobbes is a materialist, also a great fan of science, and argues that, yes, indeed, our minds are just part of the material universe. And this isn't a novel idea. This idea goes back to pre-Socratic philosophers, the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, and then later philosophers like Epicurus, who are influenced by the atomists, are also totally okay with this, although Epicurus argues for indeterminacy to give us free will. But Descartes was not okay with this, and Descartes argued that yes, indeed, the material universe is entirely deterministic and follows ordered laws that modern science can discover, but that we are most essentially our minds. So each of us has a body, but we also have a mind, and they are completely distinct kinds of stuff. This is the dualism, two substances. And according to Descartes, any property that one has, the other cannot have. They're sort of mirror images. So for example, famously, because matter is located in space, takes up space, has a location, mind is not. So according to Descartes, if you ask the question, where is my mind, you're making a mistake because your mind doesn't have a location. Your mind isn't up here. Your brain is up here. That's true because your brain is a physical object, but not your mind. Your mind doesn't have a location at all. Okay, so that's Cartesian dualism. And Ryle is saying that this is essentially the official doctrine right up to the time that he's writing, that it is generally accepted that mind and brain, mind and matter, are two different kinds of stuff. That is the ontological commitment of the official doctrine, which is the doctrine that Ryle is rejecting. And he rather dismissively calls this picture of the world the ghost in the machine. So in other words, your body is the machine, your mind, aka spirit or soul, these are all one and the same thing. Basically, the part of you that thinks is like a ghost inhabiting this machine that is your body. It's a machine because it works like clockwork. It follows rigid deterministic laws. Now, of course, it's not really in the machine, if you believe Descartes, because that would imply that it has a location, and according to Descartes, it doesn't. But certainly, we have both these elements. Now, famously, right from the moment Descartes suggested this, critics pointed out that this created a huge problem. So huge that it has the official title, the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem is how do completely different things interact? How is it? It's perfectly obvious how physical objects can cause other physical objects to move. Basically, they come into contact with them. The Cartesian view and the view of the 16th, 17th, 18th century is that the universe is like billiard balls. Actually, this is the ancient Greek atomist view, that the universe is basically tiny little objects floating around and bumping into each other. So just as one billiard ball can cause another billiard ball to move by rolling into it and hitting it, well, I can cause, it's obvious how my hand can go up because muscles pull on the bones and cause it to go up like a machine. So there's no mystery about how matter causes matter to move. But there's a total mystery about how my mind can cause my arm to move. And clearly it does, because I think go up arm and my arm goes up. So how is this interaction supposed to happen if my mind doesn't even have a location? How is it indeed, critics of Descartes ask, how is it that one mind is associated with one particular body when no minds have location? And how do you tell one mind apart from another if they don't? The reason why you can tell one body apart from another is they're in different places, but you can't do that with a mind. And why is it that one particular mind can control this body but has no influence on any other body? What's the link? And this was a problem. This is a problem for any dualistic theory. Descartes never came up with a remotely satisfactory answer. There are also epistemological problems. So the ontological problem is the mind-body problem. Now, one of the reasons Descartes insisted on this distinction is, as I said, he believed that the physical universe was rigidly deterministic, but he wanted to preserve freedom. And there are all sorts of reasons for wanting to preserve freedom. That is, freedom in the sense of having genuine options. A robot doesn't have genuine options. If you program it to raise its arm, it has to do it. It can't do otherwise. It can't choose not to. Whereas we think we can choose not to. And in fact, this is a very important belief of Christianity, which was Descartes. Descartes was a devout Christian, because unless we are free, then essentially everything we do wrong is God's fault. Because if I program a robot and it goes and kills somebody, well, you don't blame the robot, you blame me, because I'm the one that created the robot and designed it and programmed it. Well, if our minds are part of the physical universe, then anything we do wrong is God's fault, because he essentially programmed us and set the machine going. So if you want to preserve the idea that we can genuinely sin and God is right to punish us for sin, which is entirely our fault and not God's, then you have to say that we have choice, and this is part of the reason for saying that our minds are this other thing. Now, the epistemological problem that is associated with the mind-body problem is the problem of other minds. And Descartes, actually, it's kind of shocking when you read Descartes. Of course, I would be reading it in translation, but he talks about looking out of his window and seeing people walking around, and he says, for all I know, they're automatons. And it's like, you're writing in the 1500s, Descartes. How are you talking about robots? They didn't have robots back then. But basically, he's saying, his point is, I don't know that anybody but me has a mind. Why? Because the mind is totally inaccessible. This is something Ryle stresses. He says, according to the official doctrine, two things are true. You have complete access to everything in your mind, well, with some qualifiers. As he says, Freud has shown that there are parts of our minds that are inaccessible to us. This is a core. Notice at this time, Freud was much more accepted. Since that time, Freud's theory has more or less completely been rejected. Well, some elements of it are preserved, but most of what Freud said has been questioned. But at the time, Freud is suggesting that we have unconscious urges, parts of our minds that we don't have access to. Sartre, for example, thought this was ridiculous. He says, if it's our mind, we must have access to it, and if there's parts of us that we don't have access to it, that's not part of our minds, that's something else. So Sartre rejected the Freudian idea of unconscious, and there is something pretty weird about it. But in general, what Ryle says is that there's this, according to the official doctrine, there's this huge divide. I have complete unfettered access to my mind, and I have zero access to your mind. So I know I have a mind, but I don't know you have a mind. I don't know anybody else has a mind because I can't get access to it. The way that I know I have a mind is that I have complete access to mental events. I feel, I can look inside my mind. I have some kind of inner sense of what's going on in my mind. I can't look into anybody else's mind. I can just see them moving around. And as Descartes said, looking out of his window, for all I know, they're a bunch of robots. I don't know that they're thinking people because I can't access their mind. I know I'm a thinking being because I can access my mind, but I can't access theirs. So this is the problem of other minds, the problem of knowing that other people have minds. According to the official doctrine, you literally can't know. You can only know that you have a mind. There's also a semantic problem, and this is where where it's hard to know where Ryle ends and Wittgenstein begins. You know, did Ryle come up with this idea by himself, or was he influenced by Wittgenstein? Because Wittgenstein says very similar things. That is, Wittgenstein has this argument about the impossibility of a private language, because you can't have a language requires public shared criteria, and that is literally impossible for a necessarily private language. It cannot be possible, says Wittgenstein, to make up your own terms about mental states. So to make up your own little dictionary of what's going on in your head, because a dictionary requires the use of terms, which require the use of rules, which are necessarily public and have to have public criteria. Obviously, the private language argument is notoriously convoluted, and that's not a good, that's not an adequate really description of it. But the point that is relevant here is, and Ryle makes a pretty good job of laying it out in this reading, is that if the official doctrine were right, then we wouldn't be able to use the mental terms that we are perfectly confident that we can use. For example, we are perfectly confident that we can recognize when someone is angry. Now, if you believe the official doctrine, you absolutely can't, because all you can say is that somebody is doing things that I do when I'm angry. But you can't say that means they're angry. And Ryle really pushes this, and I think in a way that it's a good point. He says, according to the official doctrine, here's what goes on. You feel angry, and you say, when I'm angry, let me look at myself. Let's go to a mirror. Let's see what happens when I'm angry. Oh, I'm experiencing that thing, anger. Okay, I know what that's like because I have direct access to it. I know that feeling. That's what anger is. Now, let's look at what's happening outside, what's happening to my, flesh envelope when I'm feeling anger. Oh, look, I get all red-faced. My face does this funny thing. Oh, I show my teeth. Okay, that's what I do, so those must be indicators of anger. Okay, so now I know when I see other people doing this, they must be, I assume, having this internal feeling anger. Of course, I can't know. They could just be robots that are programmed that way. But, I can basically go with that hypothesis. So it's sort of an inside-out acquisition of terms. And according to Wittgenstein and Ryle, this is totally impossible. This is not how you learn terms. You learn anger from other people. You learn the term anger from other people. And if the official doctrine was right, that would be impossible. You wouldn't be able to learn anger from other people because you wouldn't have access to their anger. So, anger can't mean, says Ryle, what the official doctrine needs it to mean. So this must mean that the official doctrine is wrong. That the official doctrine, which has these correlates, and the semantic one is the one that, as I said, lots of people pointed out the weird ontological and epistemological problems for the official doctrine. The mind-body problem, was pressed against Descartes from day one by people like Hobbes. And the problem of other minds, again, is... now, someone like Descartes can say, that's a genuine problem. That's not a problem on the same level as the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem says, look, minds can move bodies. According to your theory, there's no way to explain that, so there's something wrong with your theory. Whereas the problem of other minds, a Cartesian can say, hey, I've just exposed something that is a genuine problem that you just didn't know was a problem. You went about thinking that, you could tell that other people were thinking, but I've revealed to you that actually you shouldn't think that you don't know that other people have minds. Whereas what Ryle and people like Wittgenstein are saying is, yes, you do. You know that other people have minds as much as you know most things. And because the official doctrine denies the possibility of that, that's a problem for the official doctrine rather than an actual problem of identifying other minds. So the fact that we are able to use mentalistic terms, we are able to say, oh, so-and-so's in love, or so-and-so's angry, or so-and-so believes that there's a cookie in that box, when in fact there isn't. We're able to say all of these things about other people without having access to the ghost in the machine. So that shows that the official doctrine is false. And he goes into some details of illustrating what's wrong with this. And he uses the term category mistake. Now, category mistake, he didn't invent this idea. And in fact, he was influenced in this by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell points out, one of Bertrand Russell's central points is that surface grammar of language doesn't reflect that real grammar of thought or logic that captures the information of language. And that we make mistakes when we think that because two sentences are similar, that the logical translations of those two sentences will also be similar. Remember Russell's theory of descriptions. He says the way we use definite descriptions like the King of France is we use them as the grammatical subject of sentences. And because we assume that something must exist if it's the grammatical subject of a sentence, we assume that when we talk about the King of France, we are committed to the existence of the King of France. But what Russell showed is that the logical translation of an English sentence that uses a definite description as its subject doesn't have anything that commits you to the existence of anything as a subject of the logic. So, grammar can be misleading. A famous example is, here's a grammatical sentence. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That's totally grammatical, and if you thought that that an English sentence can only be meaningful if there are things like what it's talking about, then you would have to say, okay, there must be colorless green ideas. But of course, you cannot put these two terms together. So there are things that can be make grammatical sense according to the grammar. You know, they got nouns and adjectives in all the right places that don't actually mean anything. You're making a kind of category mistake. You're treating two things as the same type of thing because we have the same type of word for them. Another example I just saw is, this was on Instagram. It had an old interview with the Beatles. And the Beatles were introducing themselves. You know, I'm Ringo and I play the drums. I'm George and I play the guitar. And then it came to John and he said, I also play the guitar and sometimes I play the fool. You know, this is very much John liked wordplay like that. But it's an example of you make a joke by saying two sentences that seem similar but actually aren't. And the example that Ryle actually quotes is, she left in a flood of tears and a sedan chair. That is, the word, it's acting as if you can be in two things in the same way. You're in a flood of tears and you're in a sedan chair, or, you know, like a taxi. But that's just metaphorical, and if you understand that it's a metaphor, then you can see the joke. What's happening in the official doctrine is that people are not seeing that one of these terms must be used metaphorically, and in fact they're treating they're treating mind and body as if they're two kinds of things. Like he says, like we can treat a left glove and a right glove as two kinds of things. Whereas he says, actually, it's more like a left glove and a pair of gloves. Or the pair of gloves is not something over and above the left and right glove. It's something that you have once you've got the left and right glove. And he gives the example of a university. You know, somebody is brought to Oxford and shown all of the buildings, and he lists famous buildings in Oxford, like the Radcliffe Camera is a round library. It's used in a lot of movies. And all of these things, and they're shown all of these buildings and all of the 30 colleges, and they say, okay, I've seen all the 30 colleges and I've seen all the famous buildings. Where's the university? It's as if a building and a university are two separate things, and you can be shown them separately. No. The building, once you've been shown all of the buildings, you've been shown the university. And the other example is once you've been shown cricket, you've seen team spirit. Team spirit is not something over and above cricket. It's just a way of doing cricket. It's not something like cricket and another thing of the same kind. So he's saying, how do we apply this to mind and body? Well, a simplistic way of applying this to mind and body is behaviorism. So if you are a behaviorist, you think that when I've been shown somebody going like this, there's not something beyond that that is anger. That's it. That's anger. So what is anger? It's physical behavior. So you can literally see anger because it is behavior. The thing about behavior, and why people were behaviorists, behaviorists started in psychology, but it had a huge influence in philosophy, because it avoids the problem of other minds. And also, it enables a scientific study of the mind. Because if you're a big fan of science, you want to apply science to everything, wherever possible. But one thing that it seems impossible to apply science to is the mind. Why? Because science has to have public criteria. You can't do a scientific experiment that only you can do, because science has to be checked by your peers. So if I say, I've scientifically determined that I'm angry, that's not science if the only way you can do that is introspection into this ghost in the machine. So if we are to stand any chance of doing scientific study, if psychology is to stand any chance of being a science, then it must be that the subject matter of psychology is publicly accessible. Well, what's obviously publicly accessible? Behavior. Behavior is your outward presentation. So if that's what the mind is, then the mind can be studied. And of course, can also be learned publicly. That is, this is how we learn mental, this would remove the mystery from how we acquire mental terminology. How do we teach a kid what anger is? We show them anger because this is anger. There's nothing more to anger than the behavior. That's simple behaviorism. Okay, is that Ryle's view? Well, a lot of people took him as having this view. But there are certainly interpreters of Ryle who argue that that's missing his point. And even in the chapter that you've read, there's a couple of things he says that seem to rule that out. So, he does explicitly say, I am not, for example, denying that there occur mental processes. Now, that in itself doesn't necessarily rule him out as a behaviorist, because it could mean that when he talks about mental processes, he literally means the meaning of the term mental processes is physical behavior. But he says, doing long division is a mental process, and so is making a joke. But I am saying that the phrase there occur mental processes does not mean the same sort of thing as there occur physical processes. So his big insistence, one of the problems that he hammers on about with the official doctrine is, even though in Descartes is insistent that any property that one substance, matter, has can't be possessed by the other. So matter's essential properties are taking up space. Mind doesn't have a location. Mind's essential property is thinking. Matter cannot think. However, they still are both kinds of stuff. There are two kinds of existence. There's existing in the material sense, which involves taking up space. There's existing in the mental sense, which involves being able to think. But they both exist in the same sense. Even if they exist, what it is for each to exist is different. There's two different kinds of existence. And he wants to deny this. And he says, this is why I oppose idealism and materialism, because both of them, although they reject dualism, idealism is the view held, for example, by George Berkeley, that minds exist but matter doesn't. And materialism is the view held by most contemporary philosophers, and also Thomas Hobbes, that matter exists, but there's no spirit. Now, you'd think that Ryle would be a materialist, but he's saying what's wrong with both of them is that they are, in a sense, committed to this view that what it is for each to exist is to exist as a substance. The only thing that they differ is, the only thing that idealism and materialism differ with dualism in, is they say, well, only one of them exists. But in theory, in denying that the other one exists, they're sort of tacitly affirming that it's a possibility that the other one could exist. And so they're sort of committed to the main problem of the official doctrine, that mind and body work in similar kinds of ways. So, for example, Ryle uses this phrase, paramechanical hypothesis. He says, or he talks about the official doctrine viewing the mind as a spectral machine. So he says, in effect, although Descartes wanted to preserve free will, as soon as you regard the mind as an object of intellectual study, you will come up with laws of the mind. And certainly we believe, and certainly philosophers since Descartes have pointed out, look, we believe people are predictable, and we have this kind of complicated theoretical machinery for predicting people's behavior. We call it psychology, or even common sense psychology. That is, we talk about beliefs and desires, and we say, if somebody has this desire, they want this, and they believe this, that, they believe, so suppose I want cheese, and I believe that cheese is behind that door, I will predict, we can predict their behavior that they will go through that door. And, people say, well, yeah, but it's not infallible in the same way that predicting the location of a billiard ball is, if you know its momentum and nothing else will hit it. But still, it's pretty reliable. And, psychologists would be moving towards a commitment to laws of the mind. So what Ryle says is that's a paramechanical hypothesis. Even though originally Descartes denied that mind and body behaved the same way, essentially in treating them as both kinds of stuff, every time you talk about mind, you essentially have to say either a similar or an opposite thing. Every time you talk about matter, you have to say mirror image things about mind. And we end up viewing the mind as just a spectral machine. So the effect of saying that matter and mind are both kinds of thing is like the way of saying that the university and the buildings are two kinds of thing, and you can have both of them, and they behave, what you can say about one, you can say a similar thing about the other, or a related thing about the other. This leads to a view that actually undermines free will, because we end up coming up with laws of the mind. Now, at the end of the reading, the first chapter of his book, he says that, you know, it's not, the paramechanical hypothesis is not all bad. It's kind of like what Marx says about capitalism. Marx never actually says capitalism is bad, and in effect he actually says capitalism is an improvement. Well, if he's not really entitled to say improvement, but certainly capitalism is better for people under it than what came before it. Now, capitalism is still riddled with contradictions and worthy of criticism, but it's still better than what came before. And Ryle says a similar thing about the paramechanical hypothesis replaced a parapolitical myth. If you read, for example, Plato's Republic, he talks about the rational part of the soul ruling the other two parts of the soul, and in effect the body. So it's as if this is parapolitical, in that the way the mind is described as behaving is like a political leader to the body, you know, having authority over. So the idea that instead the mind just causes the body. So the mind, even in Descartes would say that what causes my arm to raise when I decide to raise it is my mind. So there is this mechanical connection between mind and body, even though, of course, we can't have any idea of how this happens because of the mind-body problem. This is still a better hypothesis than to say my mind goes up because it was, my arm goes up because it was ordered to by my mind, and it's in some sense subjugated by my mind and in fear of my mind, or something like that. That makes even less sense than this. But back to Israel, a behaviorist. Well, there are obvious problems with basic behaviorism, and that is, the most obvious one is acting, right? We can make sense of the notion of someone appearing to be angry without actually being angry. And of course, a behaviorist can't say that. If a behaviorist says anger is the behavior, then to be angry is to do this. And what everybody agrees is that no, you can fake it, or you can be angry without showing any sign, you know, or you can be in pain without showing any sign, because, you know, you could be stoic, or you could be tranquilized, you know, or you know, you've just been paralyzed. Paralyzed people appear not to be capable of emotion according to behaviorists, because they're not showing the behavior, and that is just obviously wrong. So that's a problem with behaviorism. Now, Ryle seems to be at least a sophisticated behaviorist, because he talks about dispositions. And we see this discussion in the chapter by David Armstrong. David Armstrong talks about this, whereas the reading from Ryle that we've got doesn't talk about it. So I'll say a little bit about it. A disposition, the analogy that's always used, and Armstrong talks about this, is brittle. Brittle, we would say, is a feature of glass. Glass is brittle. Now, what does that mean? Well, you can give a sort of behavioristic analysis of brittleness. You can say what it is for something to be brittle right now, as it's sitting there unmolested on the table, is to have a feature such that, so this is a counterfactual property of it, because it's not actually breaking right now, but something is brittle such that if I were to drop it, it would break. So right now it is brittle because it has this counterfactual property that it would break if I dropped it. So if we're allowed something like that, we could say, say, for example, the paralyzed person, that he's angry because he's in a state such that if he weren't paralyzed, he would be displaying this behavior. Or if he weren't acting, he would be displaying this behavior, or something like that. So this looks like a way to be a little bit more sophisticated. You can be angry without actually showing anger behavior, or you can be not angry and show the behavior. Now, whether or not these dispositions are possible is, or whether or not a behaviorist can really talk about these dispositions is an open question. But certainly Ryle is not a crude behaviorist. And some people suggest that he's not really a behaviorist at all because he's not committed to the idea that all there is to anger or any mental state is behavior. What he's saying is that in order for us to be capable of using mental terms in the way that we clearly are, as he says about the problem of other minds, in order for me to even frame the problem, I would have to be able to describe myself in mental terms. So I would have to be able to acquire the language of mental terms. And the only way to acquire the language of mental terms is in a public setting. Again, this is like Wittgenstein's argument against private language. So I couldn't even, the problem of other minds couldn't even exist if the official doctrine were right. If the only way, my only access to minds is through introspection. So instead, it must be the case that my acquiring the mental terms must be done publicly. So there must be some way to be able to talk to use mental terms and to correct oneself. We must be able to say, oh, I thought that guy was angry, but now I see that I was wrong because, and so there must be ways that I can tell when somebody is faking. So maybe it's like not just bodily behavior, but more sophisticated cues than simple behaviorism sounds. But certainly the key point that Ryle is making is that this way of viewing mind and body as two separate substances doesn't just create philosophical problems like the mind-body problem or the problem of other minds. There's a more fundamental problem that if it were true, we wouldn't be able to even talk about it. We wouldn't be able to frame the issue in languages and mental terms in the way that we do. So there isn't just the problem of if it were true, how do I raise my arm? It's if it were true, how do I even talk about myself? I can't even use languages like I know I'm angry, because in order to know that you're angry, you have to know what anger is, and you have to have learned that from somebody else. And if what anger meant is something in my mind, then I can't learn the term anger from somebody else, because I can never get at what's in their mind. Now, in response to Ryle, you might say, well, there are problems with Ryle, such as, but there does seem to be something that I do have private access to. It does seem to be the case that I can have feelings that I cannot convey to somebody else. I cannot have somebody else feel my feelings. There's no given that there's no such thing as telepathy. I really do have direct access to something that somebody else doesn't have access to. What's that? And Ryle doesn't seem to have an answer. So, Ryle's challenge is an important one. I think Ryle tends to be dismissed because people say, well, his positive theory is behaviorism. Behaviorism is stupid. You know, we had a fad for behaviorism with Skinner and all that in the mid-20th century. We're past that, so we don't need to read Ryle anymore. Well, as is often the case with philosophy, philosophers offer negative criticisms of opposing views and a positive view. The positive view always has a sell-by date, always will go out of fashion, always will be subject to criticisms of later thinkers. But that doesn't mean that the negative criticisms of other views lose their power. And so Ryle is still worth reading, even if he is actually a behaviorist, which is open to question. You still read Ryle for his criticisms of the alternatives. And people who defend Ryle say, hey, Ryle's criticisms don't just apply to Descartes, because even if we throw out Descartes, we don't have to say, well, Ryle was just criticizing Descartes. Nobody believes Descartes anymore, so nobody needs to read Ryle. No, his views apply to things like idealism and materialism. And his challenge of how it is that we acquire mental terms is still an important challenge and a novel contribution, even though, you know, Wittgenstein is saying similar things. So that's, and also he contributed these terms like category mistake. I think even though the idea of a category mistake existed before, I think he's the one who came up with the term. And I think he may have invented the term the ghost in the machine, which, you know, is used as the title of a Police album. So he contributed a lot. And when I was an undergraduate in the politics, philosophy, and economics library building, there was a room called the Ryle Room. So he made his contribution in that way as well.